LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8:04. Welcome to Cross Question, LBC's political panel debate show. You can watch us on YouTube, on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, on the Facebook page or Twitter feed. And we want your questions. 0345 6060 973 if you have a question to put to our panel. Let me introduce them. Caroline Flint. She probably flinches every time I say former Labour MP, but I guess you're getting used to it now, Caroline.
Yeah,
Just
no,
about.
Not really, no.
Oz Katerji is a freelance journalist and host of Corbynism, the Post-Mortem podcast. We might do a bit of post-mortem on this show as well. Ella Whelan is a columnist at Spiked Online and author of What Women Want. And Bob Blackman is Conservative MP for Harrow East. They're here to take your calls.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question. It's Jim in Billericay. Hello, Jim.
Hello, Ian. It's my understanding that a government's primary duty is the safety of its citizens. Now, this new legislation should have been introduced a long time ago. It seems to me that it's high time we realigned our principles into prioritising the safety of innocent men and children first and pursuing the rehabilitation of offenders second. I'm thinking really of terrorism at the moment more than in the other crimes that are affected. But if these terrorists believe that by murdering complete strangers they'll be rewarded by spending eternity with 72 virgins, it's tantamount to insanity. Maybe some can be re-radicalised and brought back in society, but it would take a lot longer than a short stay in prison, where they're invariably surrounded and encouraged to continue their beliefs by their own kind.
OK. Bob Blackman, this legislation, presumably, well, it went through on the nod, so you didn't even have to vote for it.
Correct.
Today. Is it really wise to pass such legislation as a reaction to an event? And it sort of rather begs the question, well, why wasn't it done a long time ago?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, why wasn't it done a long time ago? The reality is that what we're talking about doing is not extending anyone's sentence. We're talking about saying that they should serve the sentence that they were handed down as a result of their crimes. And the reality is that what we should be doing is keeping the public safe from people that have the decision making to actually cause harm to the public. And I think this is long overdue, this legislation. So I think it was agreed across party. There was a lot of debate this afternoon from many eminent lawyers who are in the House of Commons about the impact and effect of this. And I think several pointers were made to protect the legislation against the lawyers that may seek to unpick it.
The problem is, though, that you've been in power for 10 years, and this is not something that has just immediately happened over the last few months. This ought to have been something that people in government had foreseen, surely, because lots of people have been sent to prison for terror offences. The sentences aren't a secret.
Well, I think the view which was taken was clearly that people should be reformed and then being able to reconnect with society. We are talking with people convicted of the most serious terrorist offences that, if they're released, clearly are not reformed. I mean, that's really the challenge here, because they will be subject to a proper review to see if they are fit to be released into society once again. But we have to protect society, and I'm afraid sometimes you have to learn the lessons from your mistakes. These people that have committed terrorist offences after they've been released from prison clearly have committed these terrorist offences, and now we have to take action.
Oz Katerji, do you think that essentially the government is going to have to just own up and say, well, look, we can't keep these people in prison forever. They've had sentences, and even if they aren't released halfway through, they're going to be released at some point, and they can't just be locked up for life. I mean, the human rights consequences of that are unthinkable for a democracy.
I think the human rights issue is a very, very important one, but I want to bring it back to an ideological issue for a start. The Conservatives, as you said, have been in power for a long time now, and they came into power on the idea that we were going to cut public spending and try and maximise our returns for less money. Now, that sets an incentive across the country. Councils, in every department, we need to maximise the amount. Keeping people in prison is very expensive, right? You can't keep people in prison and expect to have a successful functioning de-radicalisation programme while cutting public spending, cutting the amount of prison guards, cutting the amount of money that prisons get. If you want to de-radicalise people, you're going to have to invest in that. Now, I do think that when a sentence is handed down for something as serious as planning a terrorist act, that sentence should be followed through. The question is why are people incentivized to give people early releases, and based on what assessment? Who's making those assessments? Clearly something hasn't been working with the way the government has been doing things, and the fault lies with the government.
Does it, though? Because there are some people, and I think a couple of your colleagues, Bob, said this in the Commons this afternoon, Alicia Kearns and somebody called Daly, who I've never heard of before, but is a Conservative MP, and they both said that in their view, it's more or less impossible to de-radicalise people in prison. And you can understand the logic of that. But if you think, well, that's not possible, do you just give up on them? What do you do?
I mean, these are always going to be difficult questions to solve. I think one thing we have to understand is that anyone can be radicalised. You don't have to be an Islamist to be radicalised. And we're seeing the growth of far-right terrorism across the Western world now, in which people are secular, and they're having, conspiring to create terrorist acts out of secular purposes, so the idea that it's all about religious ideology that leads to radicalization isn't true. We need to approach radicalization the same way we approach violent crimes. I mean, I think also the way we look at it, many of the terrorists suspects or people that have been committing terrorist acts across the world, they have things that in common. A lot of them are involved in domestic violence, before they turn to terrorism. A lot of them have these kinds of histories. I mean, it's not, there are markers that we can identify, and there are things that we can do to try and address these issues. I certainly don't think you can imprison people forever based on ideological purposes.
Okay.
But
Ella Whelan, do you think it is possible to de-radicalise people? I mean, after the Second World War, many Germans were denazified, is a horrible phrase, but I'm not sure how you can necessarily compare the two things. But if people think that they are on some mission, that makes it very difficult, doesn't it?
I think you can't ever give up on the idea that it's possible to de-radicalise people, or that it's possible to change people's minds, it's possible to rehabilitate. I mean, why do we have a system in place if we don't believe in the prospect of rehabilitation? I don't think we should ever give up on people as a principle. But this is a really complicated picture, because what are we de-radicalising them or rehabilitating them into? I mean, the wider existential crisis here for the British state is, why is it that these people, the Islamist terrorists specifically, and I do think that there's a specific issue in relation to a difference from other type of people who are radicalised far right or otherwise, why particularly are these Islamist attackers so hateful for Western values or the way we live our lives in the UK? Why do they hate us? Why are they attacking ordinary people? Why are they attacking kids at concerts? What is going on there? What is that existential threat? And the question that the British state, the British government and society as a whole hasn't been managed to answer is, what do we stand for? What are the values that we hold dear that we should get these people to believe in? And part of it is that we're full of cowardice of being able to stand by our own values.
I'm not sure I buy that. I can remember back in 2005, 2006 having these discussions when I was working for David Davis, who was then Shadow Home Secretary, and I would go into the Home Office where Hazel Blears was the Security Minister. And, I mean, all of these things were being discussed at that point. We're now in 2020. It's 14 years later.
If you take, for example, an idea that I would a value that I would like us to hold in the UK as a society or across the world is a belief in freedom, liberty, freedom of speech, for example. And if that's a value that you can really say, all right, your way of living under an Islamist state does not believe in freedom. We do, and here is the examples of reasons why we believe in it. But of course, you've got things like the prevent strategy, which is something that the government's pursuing, which is, completely against any kind of freedom of speech. It's about curtailing people. And so if the proof isn't in the pudding of you actually believing in these things and standing by them, don't get me started on the issues of free speech we've got in this country. How do you convince an Islamist that you believe in it if you don't even yourself?
Caroline Flint, I'll come to you last because I know, I think your first ministerial job was in the Home Office, wasn't it? So you've served there, and okay, that it was kind of, it was about the time some of these things were coming to prominence. But what was your experience in government dealing with these kind of issues, and how do you think we've progressed over the last 10 or 15 years?
Well, my remit when I was a Home Office Minister was tackling organised crime. I dealt with drugs.
Careful how you say that.
Guns, knives, all of those side of things. So, but what is clear is that, what I knew about organised crime was that actually, often you had maybe the big bosses at the top, but it had its sort of, tentacles right back down into our communities. And that quite frankly, for organised crime, everything was a commodity, whether it was a human being or whether it was counterfeit cigarettes or illegal drugs. I think part of it is how difficult these issues are when you have someone who, whatever route they've taken to undertake a terrorist attack or be part of a plan for a terrorist event, and I think the routes into it vary enormously, is what do you do when they get a prison sentence and what do you do when they're there? And I suppose one of the things about government is, on the one side, when I was a Home Office Minister, actually justice came under the Home Office. We had everything in that department entirely. Now, I'm not saying that's the perfect model, but one thing is for sure, is that if you have the enforcement side in one government department, and then you have, if you like, the execution, wrong word maybe to use, of what the sentence should be for the person who's brought to court and found guilty, how do you make sure you have joined up thinking about what happens when they go into prison and what happens when they come out? And I think, for me, I think this legislation is right. I think if someone has a sentence of 20, 30 years, actually, that's their sentence. But if they've committed violent offences, whether it's under terrorism or in other ways, there should be some way to assess them about how they're going to be safe in the community once they're released. And that's the bit of this, whether it's for those who've committed terrorist offences or for those who've committed sexual violent offences or murder. Is the system really working? And I don't think it is really. And nobody seems to be interested until the point at which someone's released and they commit the same crime again. And that has to change.
Do you think it might be a better idea to bring prisons back inside the Home Office? I mean, Theresa May famously said to Ken Clarke, I lock them up, you let them out.
Look, on one level, there's an argument for bringing it all together entirely. I mean, I happen to think actually on immigration that maybe there's a case for actually having a separate department that looks at all aspects of migration, so we can have a focus. And to be honest, immigration and the people working in it have often been the poor relatives when it's come to resources across Whitehall and the less valued service. I think it's about joined up thinking. You can make a case for literally every department being put into one pot. But actually, it's about how it's working and who is responsible, whether it's the parole board, whether it's the prison service or the courts to say, well, what has actually happened when we've sent someone to prison, for making sure that there's some undertaking to address that person's offending behaviour. I, like Ella, think that you have to believe that you can change people's behaviour, but you can't be assured that it will happen with everyone. And that's where the assessment comes into it. But also once they leave prison and they may fall back into the same groups they were with before they went in, how do you make sure you manage that and don't let that happen again is really key.
Well, let's move on. And let me just remind you, you can watch our proceedings as well as listen to them on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, the Facebook page, YouTube channel or Twitter feed. Let's go to David in Hampstead. Hi, David.
Hi, Ian. Great to speak to you and a great show.
Thank you.
So just a question really for all of the panellists, but I suppose for Bob Blackman and Caroline Flint maybe a little bit more. Why does it just seems like all the main political parties, so Labour, Conservative, they seem since the election to be almost trying to, I suppose, out-socialist each other when it comes to hammering business. And the reason I say that is, I'm the sort of demographic that's really ripe pickings for any party. I'm 27. I started my own business. I didn't have some kind of millionaire backer or anything. It's going well, we employ people, etc., etc. And actually, the sort of the days of the past of incentives for business and all the benefits that come with that they just seem to put the handbrake on. Corporation tax was supposed to come down. That tends to bring in more for the exchequer, etc. That tends to generate more jobs, more money, and all the rest of it. And they just all seem to think, how do we appeal to the masses now that the election's over? And the answer just seems to almost always be, let's really, really slam business. And I don't really get why.
Okay. Ella Whelan, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, the interest that phrase out-socialist each other is kind of funny because aside from policy promises, there has been this general tone post the December election of, right, we've won over northern working class people, and what they really want is for us to all pretend to be holier than thou, the kind of, I don't know if I'd call it socialist, but everyone now has a friend who's got an accent, and everyone's dad worked in some kind of factory at some point, and it's really boring. But
you can't be a radio presenter without an accent nowadays.
but
I won't last long.
The underlying element of it is actually, are politicians taking these voters seriously? Because one of the interesting things that's come out of the response to the Labour Party's defeat, for example, is that people didn't believe the promises that were being made, or they simply, it didn't wash with them what was called kind of, I've talked to people who called it bribes and things like that. Similarly, the news about promises around the mansion tax with Boris Johnson and the Tories now changing their stripes and moving towards some Labour policies is also questionable. But the idea of what a country needs moving forward is investment in things like business, is investment in innovation, is a kind of kickstarting of a new mode of production. You can't just make the right noises and put on the flat cap and try to identify voters with that. You actually have to give them what they want, which is a new and better plan for the economy, basically.
Caroline Flynn, is this partly, listening to what Ella was saying about the two parties moving together, the Tories becoming a little bit more Labour-y on some things, is this part of Boris Johnson's strategy to shore up the Labour voters that effectively led to your defeat?
Well, we saw signs of that in the general election itself. I mean, every party's discovered the money tree, haven't they, that Theresa May found so difficult to find. Yes, I mean, I think part of it is a realisation that actually, the sort of spending pot was, just dried out from cuts over the last 10 years. And dare I say it, back in, 2010, 2011, 2012, Labour was saying, actually, look, we understand we do have to make some cuts here, but there's a danger going so far. You starve every service of the oxygen they need to do a good job. We've just been talking about the penal system, and what's happened there. We lost 20,000 police officers, and now we're promised we're going to have 20,000 more to get back to where we were. But you can't create police officers overnight. So I think there is definitely a recognition that actually there were cuts that went too far and too fast and caused so many of the problems that people were concerned about. But I think also is if you're going to rebalance the economy in this country, that recognises that London is a really important part of our economy, but there's too much of a hothouse in this part of our nation, then you've got to spend some money to change that. You've got to create the infrastructure, but also don't forget, in creating the infrastructure, you get the materials, the steel, and the jobs that you create that surround that, and the supply chains into that. So David was saying about business. I wasn't sure if there was something specific that David was concerned about that he feels his business is being slammed with, but part of this is about recognising you have to invest, and there's never been a better time to borrow money than it is now. But also, if you really are going to rebalance the economy, and all those new Tory MPs in Labour seats like Don Valley and elsewhere, they'll be expecting some payback from their government to shore up their position as well. So I think it is interesting about the dynamics that have changed in this. But at the same time, going to Ella's point, certainly amongst my voters, the idea that you can promise everything. People aren't stupid. They don't believe that. And one of the problems for Labour was, whilst there were some individual policies that definitely people would sign up to, and in fact the Tory government has signed up to, renationalising Northern Rail, for example, it just went on too much, and they just lost credibility. I mean, we're literally free everything. And people didn't understand that. and that's where I think I'm afraid our manifesto and the promise we've made didn't help us.
Oz, do you think this is a classical bit of triangulation by Boris Johnson, where he's essentially going onto Labour Party territory? But there's a danger in that, isn't there? Because he could alienate a lot of his own supporters, and it seems as though David is somebody who might be alienated by that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the idea that Boris Johnson's moving towards socialism is hyperbolic nonsense. This is a very conservative government.
Say what you mean.
No, but I mean, let's be fair. This is one of the most conservative, if not the most conservative government that I've ever had in my lifetime.
You're so young.
Is it?
Well, you're so young.
In what way?
Maybe okay. I mean, just look. That aside, to my own personal view of this. Boris Johnson has built a new electoral coalition, right? And to keep that electoral coalition, he needs to make people happy that the Conservatives haven't really worried about the workington man before this election. It wasn't really, or maybe they started moving towards that. It wasn't a huge deal for them. But the one thing we don't hear so much about now is the deficit. I mean, we had Cameron come in
You're right.
On this idea that the only way to fix our problems, the massive problems that we inherited from, Blair and Brown and the financial crisis, which a lot of it was blamed on Blair and Brown, but really was a global problem that wasn't, they got treated a bit unfairly in that regard. The idea was, we need to fix the deficit, and that's the way to solve everything. And when
anyone
everything
know what the deficit is now?
Well, when it's not even a topic of conversation.
You're
it's not
absolutely
even
right.
a topic of conversation anymore. I mean, but also the idea that this is Britain. It's not America. We have universal health care. We Conservatives, even in the tradition that I'm remembering, were people that were supposed to be proud of the public services that Britain has for people, proud of using the country's wealth to benefit the people. I don't think this is, Cuban style, Venezuelan style socialism that we're talking about. What we're talking about is an ideology that saw everything as a nail, and cutting the deficit was the hammer to fix all of those problems. And then now, a decade later, we're dealing with all of these problems that, we cut 20,000 nurses and we cut, and everything's struggling now. So let's throw some more money. All they're doing is winding back. We are facing big problems as a country now. We are leaving our biggest trading bloc. We still have a deficit, yet at the same time we need to generate more money and stimulate our economy even further. So there are going to be compromises being made. And right now, let's be fair, the Conservatives are probably better at making those compromises than the Labour Party are. The Labour Party is in a position where compromise is not really on their agenda right now, whereas Boris Johnson and his lot seem to have won the argument against Philip Hammond and his lot. So, I think it's a case of rhetoric, but I don't think it's a case of socialism. I really don't.
Now, Bob Blackman, you're about the least socialist Conservative member of Parliament I can think of, which isn't why we've got you on the programme. But,
No.
I mean, do you get a little bit worried about some of these spending splurges that we're seeing in all sorts of different areas at the moment?
Well, I mean, obviously, one of the things that the Chancellor has said to all spending departments is find me 5% reductions. So protected environments, such as National Health Service and the police and so on, will be.
But there's not
funded
another
additionally.
5% to squeeze out, is there?
Well, having come from a background in local government, I can tell you that
They've had
every
40%
year,
cuts.
but actually, every local authority leader across the country will say to spending departments, find me some money that I can then choose to send somewhere else. I mean, I think the key here is that the economy last year grew a minor amount, way below the rate of inflation. And so the way you get business working is obviously investment. I think your caller, and this coming back to the central question here, is how we make sure that business actually starts to grow. Now, business has to make decisions about investment. One of the things that was holding us back was, are we going to leave the European Union or are we not? And now we've heard that lots of businesses will now choose to borrow money to invest to create the jobs that we need, that then brings in the taxes that we all need to fund the public services. So there is an equation that fits with this and a cycle that runs. We now, of course, have more people employed in this country than ever before. Unemployment rate is lower than it's been since records began.
But David isn't happy. He thinks that you and the Labour Party are trying to out-socialist each other, and it's an extraordinary allegation to make, but I can understand why he's making it.
Yeah, well, clearly, one of the things we need to do is we've got to reform business rates, which, if it's a small business, that will be a big issue, I guess, for his bottom line. Corporation tax is at the lowest level it's been since I can ever remember. But we said we would reduce it. But Boris's Prime Minister said, we'll freeze that for the moment. And then when the time is right, we'll reduce it again to encourage business
Which
to
in
invest.
itself was extraordinary, because he'd been arguing that the more you reduce it, the more money you get in. So he then argued against himself.
As long as you get growth in the economy. That's the key. If you get growth in the economy and you get businesses making more money, making more profit, then you generate the corporation tax.
Right, let's hear from David again. What do you make of what you've heard, David?
I don't think, unfortunately, you've kind of really answered it, because my business doesn't pay business rates.
Okay.
It's almost entirely online. Yet it's still hammered, whether it's class or national insurance, whether it's corporation tax, whether, to be honest, even it's...
How can you say you're hammered by corporation tax when it's at its lowest rate ever?
I'm saying, what I'm saying is that they're not incentivising through those means. And I just think that for far be it from me in Hampstead to say that I can speak for Workington Man, but I don't think Northerners and those Northern voters, they're hard-working people. They don't want handouts. They rejected that at the election. They don't want that kind of...
Okay, so what incentives do you want then?
I think just a whole... it's ambitious to say a whole reform of the taxation system. I think the way we go about it, we are a very high-tax country in terms of income and general taxation across the world. And I just think that they've proven, the Conservatives in past years, that when you reduce taxes, you incentivise business, and I think that you also, you generate more money for the economy, you generate more jobs.
All right, Oz is shaking his head there. Why are you shaking your head?
I mean, it's just like you want everything. You want better public services, but you want to spend less money. You want to grow the economy, but you want to leave our largest trading bloc. You want everything, and you want unicorn policies in the same way that Labour are promising money for everyone. Look, the biggest problem that I find, and I can only speak for my generation, is that people in my generation are working. You talk about employment like it's an issue. Yeah, I don't think unemployment is a massive issue for people facing this country. The problem is people are working their fingers to the bone, and at the end of the day, they still can't afford housing.
Yes.
I've been working 10 years now as a journalist. As a relatively middle class profession, I can't afford a house. I'm so far away from Help to Buy and buying a property for myself to start a family. It's unthinkable. I'm in my 30s, And I graduated university at the height of the financial crisis. Where was there for people in my generation to go? It's no wonder that Corbynism was so popular, because people were promised all of this stuff. Your life's going to be made so much better by voting for us. Boris has done pretty much the same, in my opinion, to northern working class communities. It says he's going to invest.
Ella.
Welcome to the experience of working class people for decades, that they haven't been able to buy houses or do any of the things that we
My father's a
expect
refugee
to do,
and a builder.
I'm just saying that's a piece of context that we've got to remember. But I think the interesting thing post Brexit, it's kind of the B word's been floating around like a ghost in here.
Let's not go there.
But I'll go there very briefly, which is that the exciting thing is you have an electorate which has taken a risk. It's been told by big business, by politicians, by everyone under the sun, basically, that their vote is going to equal economic catastrophe. And they went for that risk anyway, and guess what? It hasn't happened yet. But so you have this really exciting prospect of this electorate that's saying, right, we're ready for some big change, take a few risks, do something exciting with this.
Okay, we're going to move on to a different question in a moment, but first let's get the LBC News headlines at 8:31 with Serena Farrow.
The Home Secretary has exclusively told LBC that today's move to prevent terrorism will mean people will be safer on the streets. An emergency law to stop terrorists automatically being released after half their sentence will now move to the Lords for further scrutiny. It's after passing through the Commons earlier today. A ninth case of coronavirus has been confirmed in the UK, a patient in London. The Chief Medical Officer for England says they're being treated at a specialist NHS centre after flying here from China. And police in Northern Ireland have charged a man with the murder of the journalist Lyra McKee. She was shot while witnessing a riot which broke out in Londonderry last April. The new IRA's previously apologised for the killing. LBC weather, while gales in Scotland and North East easing off tonight. Heavy rain and gusty winds, though, spreading to more central and southern areas. Feeling quite chilly with a low of 2 degrees.
LBC.
Attention, please. Weird Health Span would like to tell you something that, quite possibly, you didn't already know. Not all supplements are created equal. I know. Who'd have thought? We travel the entire globe to find the best ingredients for our vitamins and supplements. From the southern slopes of India for our turmeric to the cold, crisp seas of Greenland for our cod liver oil. Because that's the Healthspan way. Well, there you go. It's not every day you learn something new, is it? We're Healthspan. That's healthspan.co.uk. Vitamins and supplements. In-store or direct to your door.
My name's Luke. I live in Dunstable with my wife and 4 daughters. We've got a Ring doorbell too out the front. Every time there's someone who comes up to the door, it notifies my phone, and then I can actually see if there's anyone dodgy at the door. A while ago, we had an incident at the house. My wife and I was in bed about 1:30 in the morning. We got a notification on my Ring app on my phone. So I looked on the actual video itself, and it showed me that he was trying to get underneath the mat to see if there was a key there so he can actually get into the house. The video clip allowed the police to see exactly who is in front of the camera and where that person was touching the door, and that allowed the crime scene technician to dust for prints. Thanks to the video clip and his fingerprints, that was enough to convict him. The most important thing for me is when I'm not here during the night, I need to know that the family's safe, and Ring Doorbell does that.
Join Luke and the millions of people protecting their homes with Ring. Learn more at ring.com.
You know it'll happen. That dodgy boiler will finally pack up, and it'll do it on the coldest day of the year. So the moment you decide you can't put it off any longer, get a quote from British Gas. You can spread the cost of a new boiler interest-free over 2 years and get £200 off when you get a quote by the 29th of February, or £400 off for existing home care customers. British Gas, here to solve. Search British Gas new boiler. Conditions apply.
Play along with our 10-second teaser. Ready? True or false? More Monopoly money is printed in the US every year than real money. The answer is true. Very handy for buying Mayfair. If you got that right, you must be pretty smart. So you'll know who to choose for your business accounting, audit and tax affairs. Search Barnes Rofe. Clever accountants for business.
If you're an EU citizen living in the UK, you need to apply to the EU Settlement Scheme. The scheme is open, so apply as soon as you can, even if you have permanent residence. You can apply to the EU Settlement Scheme online, and support is available if you have any questions. To find out more and apply, visit gov.uk/EU Settlement Scheme. Irish citizens and those with valid indefinite leave don't need to apply.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Let me reintroduce you to my panel. Caroline Flint is a former Labour MP for Don Valley. Oz Katerji is freelance journalist and host of Corbynism, the Post-Mortem podcast. That is a very forbidding title for a podcast, Oz. Just tell us why you're doing it.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the Jewish Chronicle covered it the other day, and they called it Corbyn, the Post-Mortem, and I had to say, no, it's definitely not. It's definitely not called that. Look, I just think, after Labour's historic defeat, it was a historic defeat. We needed to understand the reasons why, and for me, I'm not a conservative. It's very unlikely that I'm ever going to vote Conservative. But at the same time, I voted Liberal Democrat, just to put that on the record. You need a strong political opposition, and for me, Labour decided to view itself with an idea of self-righteousness and preening vanity rather than confronting the major issues of today, foreign policy issues, Brexit. These became internal ideological discussions between Labour members and each other. So that's why I made it out there, because I want not just Labour to understand, but the country to understand.
Well, you have to retitle it after April the 4th.
Yes. Well, no, it's going to end after.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Right.
We're running until just after the Labour leadership
podcasts,
election.
I don't know.
Yes, a limited series.
It's typical of this age, isn't it? The attention span of a flea. Ella Whelan is a columnist at Spiked Online and author of What Women Want. It's got a fascinating subtitle, this book. Go on.
Everyone's always scared to read it out. Fun, freedom and an end to feminism. Hold on to your hats. It's actually not that controversial.
I'm sure Bob Blackman will be reading it. He's Conservative MP for Harrow East. Right, let's go to another question. Big issue of the week. Greg in Brentwood has a question on it. Hello, Greg.
Hi there.
What's your question?
It's more of a personal question rather than professional in terms, which would be, and I'd like a lot of MPs to even answer this, Boris Johnson himself, even though I voted to elect him. Do you think it's humanly moral to spend £100 billion when homelessness is something that's still not solved?
Right. Caroline Flint.
Well, I think if you're going to spend £100 billion on a major transport infrastructure project, you've got to be pretty clear about why you're doing it and what for. And in this particular case, ask yourself the question about why has it trebled in terms of the amount they're spending on it compared to what it was at the start. And when I was an MP, I used to sit on the Public Accounts Committee, and we had the HS2 up people in front of us on many occasions, and were promised all sorts of things. And I
didn't ask the right questions.
and I would have to say that one of the problems is, I think across government departments, the level of skills necessary to deliver these projects and hold those to account is not as good as it might be. I mean, one of our recommendations of the Public Accounts Committee was that anybody who's a permanent sec had to have delivered a successful big major project. Just a little thing you could put on the job description, it might actually help. But I think the only other thing I would say on that, Greg, is that it is a lot of money. But actually, I do think there is a need for infrastructure in our railway system, our transport system. But on a project like this, which is a way off being delivered, the question is who holds everybody to account for what happens along the way. And that is always a problem with these projects, because they all start with the best intentions. They all say they're going to create X number of jobs and help X number of communities. But when all the dust is settled, nobody really says, well, did it? And then we move on to the next project. And that's, I think, what is pretty disheartening for the public and for the way we do our politics.
And the question, in a way, could be seen as a bit simplistic, where you say, oh, well, if we spent £2 billion on homelessness, that could actually almost cure homelessness overnight. But it doesn't work like that, does it, Bob?
No, you're talking to the MP that actually introduced the Homelessness Reduction Act to Parliament and piloted that through, that's helping thousands of people who are threatened with being homeless and preventing them from literally being on the streets. The key here in terms of housing, which is one of the things that your caller has raised, is actually we've got to build a lot more houses. My personal view is we've got to build a lot more council houses across this country so that people can actually have a decent place to live in that they can call home. And that answers.
I think that's interesting, because I've never heard a Conservative say that.
Well, you heard it now, and I tell you, I hope when we hear, we haven't got onto the reshuffle yet, but when we hear the reshuffle, I hope
on that.
That's going to be a key message of the government.
Have you got your phone on?
I'm not holding my breath on that particular issue. But I think on HS2, one of the problems is that costs have spiralled out of control. There is an issue here of how we control these major projects, because this is not unique. You know, a lot of these major projects spiral out of control, and the reality is that what we've got to get back to is delivering a first-class rail service in this country that enables people to get around and get back to the principle of actually cutting down on unnecessary air traffic between airports in mainland UK, and getting people around quicker, more comfortable on trains that are convenient and go to the right places, and minimise the destructive effect on the wildlife in this country, which I think is a key issue, controlling the costs and actually delivering the service. So clearly in the reshuffle, one of the things that's going to happen is there will be a minister responsible for this whoever it is going to have to go into the depths of this and make sure that it is delivered on time and within the budget available.
See, isn't it interesting? You're pigeonholed as being on the right of the Conservative Party, and yet in that answer you talked about building more council houses and piloting through a homelessness bill. So you can't pigeonhole people nowadays in politics, can you? Oz, what's your answer to the question? HS2, could that money have been better spent elsewhere?
Well, look, I mean, I think we praise Labour a lot for this green, or a lot of people do, this Green New Revolution, Green New Deal idea. I mean, this is the Tories' Green New Deal. This is going to invest in public infrastructure. It's going to help the environment by reducing emissions, by speeding up public transport. This is the kind of thing that, as a country, it's actually a progressive idea, and we should be supporting. That's how I feel about it morally and ethically. Do I think that that politics has really it's divided the country in a few years, and some people think Labour or Tories are evil. I don't ever agree with this idea. You know, I think that Conservatives are people that care about their country, and the solutions they have are different to the solutions that I have. The solutions that I have personally, as you said, building council houses, investing. How do you get for that money? That's the question that's been going back and forth between Labour and the Conservatives for 20, 30 years, maybe, longer. How do you get the money to generate that investment? But I think we have to start by, putting a line in the sand and saying, actually, building for our country, to improve our country, like a project like HS2. We need to start getting behind those ideas. And it's not just that, building on the green belt, building more social housing, expanding Heathrow. If the country wants to grow economically, then it has to make decisions that are going to be unpopular with people who don't want things in their backyard. It's as simple as that.
Ella.
I'm going to be relatively uncontroversial and say I agree with most of that. I mean,
keep it short then, and then we can get another question.
We used the word balance. I think it was in the first question about how do you balance things, especially in relation to the economy. And actually, what we shouldn't go towards is the process of balancing the book. The spreadsheet fill style of politics, where you take a bit from here and add a bit there. And there's no reason why you couldn't not solve homelessness, but certainly do something towards it in terms of building on a mass scale, as well as building HS2, HS3, HS4, and all the different variations. Again, I think we should just aim incredibly big for this.
Isn't this actually getting to the core of this? You actually need transformational politicians to drive these things through, and there aren't many of them about at the moment. You had people, Louise Casey, she's not a politician, but when she was the homelessness czar, homelessness was almost... well, not eradicated, but it was reduced by a huge extent. You've got Michael Gove, I would say, is probably one of the only transformational ministers in this cabinet. And you kind of think, well, if you've got a big project, you want to put someone like him in charge of it and make sure that it happens. But there aren't many others, are there?
Louise, the rough sleepers strategy, part of Louise's approach, and the work she did later on antisocial behaviour as part of the Respect campaign, was to basically engage. First of all, people are on the streets, rough sleeping, they're homeless, sleeping on sofas. There's a lot of different reasons. But you've got to engage with the individual and find out what the solution is. And that's it. You have to go towards the problem rather than just standing back and think there's some.
So are we suggesting Louise Casey to run HS2?
Well, do you know what? That'd not be a bad idea.
But part of the thing that we haven't mentioned yet is that the difficulty in all of this, you brought up Michael Gove, is that the narrative, that the strong narrative in politics today is you shouldn't, in relation to climate change and in relation to, you can't move a car, you can't do anything because it's going to affect the planet. There's a narrative going on here which is telling politicians to be extremely cautious in anything they argue for. Actually, we need the exact opposite. Yeah. We need a politician with guts who's going to say, two fingers to the NIMBYs, we're going to do this because it's good for the country, and actually we can deal with climate change in any way.
Well, I think there has to be a drive through. I have a solution, by the way, to how we reduce the cost of housing, and that is you don't sell public land to private developers for them to sell on and sell on and sell on before eventually someone actually builds a house. Because if you don't take decisions now, you're not going to see that new housing for 4, 5, 6 years. So it's got to be done now. That's the key.
Greg, thank you for your question. We're going to move on to something that I'm sure Caroline Flint will want to talk about in a moment. It's 8:46.
LBC and its sister stations from Global come together to bring you...
And the winner is...
the Global Awards 2020 with very.co.uk.
Show your appreciation for LBC's Mr. Steve Allen.
With huge performances on the night from the Stereophonics, Alan Jones, Ellie Goulding and Russell Watson. See all the nominees and vote now. Download Global Player app or vote online at lbc.co.uk. You can be there. Tickets are on sale now. Thursday the 5th of March, London's Hammersmith Eventim Apollo, the Global Awards 2020.
With very.co.uk.
LBC. If you're a classic car fan, don't miss the capital's premier classic car event, the London Classic Car Show, from the 20th to the 23rd of February. It takes place at Olympia, London, with over 500 classic cars on display and to buy, over 100 exhibitors, an auction of breathtaking classics, plus our exciting new Car Stories stage, featuring motoring heroes and their legendary cars. So whether you're a classic car owner, collector, expert or enthusiast, book your tickets now at the LondonClassicCarshow.co.uk.
We need to leave now. Monty, where's your other shoe? Some things in life are hard to find quickly. Your new boiler doesn't have to be one of them. With Swell Heating's online tool, find the perfect boiler from top manufacturers like Worcester Bosch in under 5 minutes. Visit swellheating.com. Rely on us to keep you warm.
We got it at Selco. Selco, it's where the trade go.
We're permanently screwing down our prices on everyday building essentials. We've lowered prices on our best-selling lines across Unifix, Spax and Vortex screws, copper and Speedfit plumbing fittings, electrical cable and more. See selcobw.com for details. Selco, serving the trade for 125 years.
We got it at Selco. Selco, it's where the trade go.
A credit limit of up to £1,500. What do you have to do to get it? Simple. Get online and check if you're eligible for an Ocean credit card in minutes without affecting your credit score. For your Ocean credit card, visit ocean.co.uk now and get all that from Ocean. Intelligent Lending Limited is a credit broker. Capital One, the exclusive lender. Representative 39.9% APR variable. Borrow and spend responsibly. Is your smile missing from your photos? That's where Metamorphosis Orthodontics can help. We pride ourselves on putting our patients first, ensuring you feel calm during your visit and confident when you leave. From traditional fixed braces to discreet Invisalign teeth straightening, our knowledgeable and experienced team can help you transform your smile. Visit us at our beautiful practice in Parsons Green, South West London. Book an appointment today by texting SMILE to 66777 or visit metamorphosisorthodontics.com.
How do you make the most understated Range Rover even more striking? Paint it Santorini black, fit it with privacy glass, a full leather ebony interior, then place it on 21-inch gloss black alloy wheels. The Range Rover Velar R Dynamic Black, understated, has rarely been so bold. Limited numbers available for a limited price. Search Range Rover Velar, Land Rover, above and beyond.
Limited availability while stocks last at participating UK Land Rover retailers. Check with your local retailer.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:49 on LBC. Our panel: Caroline Flint, Oz Katerji, Ella Whelan, Bob Blackman, answering your questions. Anthony's in Staines. Anthony, what's your question, please?
Yes, hi there, Ian. I think you've been answering this question in some ways along the way, but it's how does Labour recapture the North? And I do include in that Scotland and the Assembly.
Caroline Flint, I think we'll come to you first.
Well, I think we need to start listening to those people in the North who feel that haven't been heard for quite a long time, I have to say. And I think part of when we listen is we respect what they've got to say. And I think one of the big problems, most recently on Brexit, is a huge number of our northern communities outside of our cities, although Sheffield voted leave as well, and at university towns did vote leave. In amongst that were Labour seats where there were lots of Labour Leave voters, and they took Labour at its word in 2017 that we respect the referendum and we'd work to deliver it with a deal, and I'm afraid we didn't do that. The last election was as much about trust as anything to do with any detail, and when you look at the seats we've lost in the Midlands and in the north of England, it's quite clear that there were other factors, such as Jeremy Corbyn, such as policies that people couldn't believe in or think we could deliver. But what sets it apart is Brexit, because if it was just the Jeremy Corbyn factor in our manifesto, we'd have seen losses more widely or at least spread across the country. But it wasn't. Brexit was the issue, and that was about trust. And this is about people feeling that for too long they've been overlooked. In Scotland, I think there's another issue going on that goes back some years. We delivered the Scottish Parliament under the Labour government. The first leader of that Scottish Parliament was Donald Dewar. I think a very great man. I think he was absolutely the right person to lead. To be honest, I think in the years that followed, to a certain extent, we didn't have some of our, bigger beasts, if you like, willing to work in Scotland to make sure that we delivered continually. And in that respect, I think we allowed the SNP to come in and very much prioritise Scotland in a way that maybe we weren't seen to do. And of course, what the SNP did do was start moving to the left, taking lots of Labour policies along with their nationalist policies. And that mixture combined, and to be honest, in some parts of Scotland where maybe Labour had taken the voters there for granted for a while, led to a massive loss for us, which we haven't been able to rebuild yet.
And do you see any hope among the 4 leadership candidates that they get this, that things might change in the future?
No, not at the moment. I think that to rebuild in England and in Wales, where we lost seats for the same reasons, where Brexit was a big factor, I think there has to be some contrition from the leadership candidates about what we did in the last few years to create that sense of frustration and anger and loss in terms of people. I met lots of Labour voters who didn't take it easily that they weren't voting Labour. They expressed loss and grief over the matter that they were thinking of voting Conservative. So I think there has to be some contrition. I think there has to be an acceptance that Brexit is happening. We're leaving the European Union, and Labour should be then focusing on some of the domestic policies which can address some of the concerns in those areas. I think if they don't do that and still bang on about somehow going back to the European Union or being seen to frustrate the process in the next year, then we'll be further behind.
Right, I'm going to ask the three of you for quite brief answers because I do want to squeeze another question in here. Ella, let's go to you.
I think that I agree with Caroline, but I don't think this can be solved by saying sorry, because I think the problem runs a lot deeper. The question of Brexit wasn't just about getting it wrong or being on the wrong side. It was about this sense that the Labour voters felt that the Labour Party held them in contempt, thought they were stupid. The discussions around second referendum specifically was about saying, you idiots up north didn't know what you were voting for, you don't know what's good for you, and we'll tell you. So that's a much deeper problem than just kind of saying, you can't just say sorry and move on from that.
Well, that's what I did mention quite a few times in the last few years
but the second thing I think as well, and it's kind of part of it, is that the Labour Party has become in its identity more, this is a controversial phrase now to use, the kind of metropolitan elite. It's moved more towards that. Just look at what's happened recent news. Rebecca Long-Bailey announcing that he's going to purge all transphobes from the party, anyone who's to do with the LGB alliance, essentially waging war on, in most cases, women who want to talk about trans issues and what it means for them. It's that kind of identity politics nonsense that people who I know, and lots of people up north, have said, for God's sake, we don't want to talk about this. This isn't relevant for us. Will you please get on with proper politics?
Okay, Bob?
Yeah, I hope they don't, of course, learn the lessons from the general election. And I think one of the things is that in 2017, when we won Mansfield, everyone went, Mansfield? How did that happen in that election? And then suddenly you saw the results went to 60-odd% of people in Mansfield voting Conservative this time round. So the reality is that one of the problems I think the Labour are going to have is that having uncorked the bottle and people having voted Conservative, we've got a lot of really good thrusting young MPs who are going to make sure that they retain their seats next time round. And people have voted tribally in many of those seats for donkey's years, and now they're going to have MPs that probably weren't expecting to become MPs, who are going to make absolutely sure they do a really good job on behalf of their constituents, so that when they come to vote the next time round, there's an incumbency factor that is always in these elections.
And of course, once you've done something once, it's easier to do it the second time, as Labour voters have done in Scotland. Oz?
Yeah, so I'll be very brief with this. I have to say I do disagree with a lot with what's been said about here. Trans issues, Brexit. Again, I speak here as the most Remain voice on the panel, and I do accept that. But at the end of the day, I think it's an issue of credibility. And the thing is Jeremy Corbyn's Labour had zero credibility. They lost an election to a humiliating margin to a man who was sacked twice for lying. So that just shows how bad Labour come across when they're trying to present themselves as the credible option. I don't think it's that they chose a second referendum or this, that or the other. I think the fact that whatever position they took, they didn't trust Jeremy Corbyn, who couldn't get anti-Semitism right, who couldn't settle down on a Brexit position, before the referendum or after the referendum. I think the fact that no one really knew what Labour stood for, and I think that Corbynites themselves were very happy to paint Corbyn in whichever light. Oh, he's in favour of this rights and he's in favour of that. They might be completely contradictory, but two Corbynites might have completely different opinions on what Corbyn himself stands for. I think if Labour want to win back votes, they need credibility. I don't think it's anything to do with a northern accent or whatever. They voted Boris Johnson Johnson who went to Eton. Okay, so I don't think that it has anything to do with, sticking a working class person up there and hoping that fixes all the problems. People don't want to be patronised. I think I agree with everyone who says that. And I think that Labour, whichever way they were positioning, was to patronise people, and I don't think that is an election-winning strategy.
Anthony, great question, thank you. Christine in Chatham has got the final question, which I'm going to give you each 1 minute to answer. It's not an easy one to do in 1 minute, though, I have to say, but I'm going to challenge you. Christine, thank you. What's your question?
Why is it okay to deport a young black guy who's kids and was prepared to lay down his life for us while serving in the British Army, but not deport a dirty old white pervert who, since being released from prison, was caught inside a primary school waving out at kids? Can you define protecting the public, please?
Ella?
I don't think it's okay to deport people in general, in terms of the moral issue of simply sending our problems with our citizens to another country. I don't agree with at all. And I think part of this issue is, as I said before, with the question of new terror laws, of what this, basically the question is being asked, what does the British state stand for? What do we stand for as a society? These deportations ask the question, what does it mean to be a citizen? What value is laid in that? How do you defend it? I mean, this has come up time and again with Shamima Begum, with the Windrush scandal, all these questions being asked, how do you value what citizenship is? And I just don't think that the idea of deporting our problems elsewhere comes back to the question of rehabilitation. You should deal with these issues and deal with these people at home.
Bob Blackman.
If you're a foreign national and a guest here and you commit a crime, you should expect to serve a full prison sentence and then be deported at the end of it.
Even if you've come here at the age of 2?
I think that what you've got to be clear on is, if you come here as an adult, I think we should be clear.
Okay.
If you come here as an adult, you commit a crime, you obviously pay the penalty for that crime, and then you should be deported and not allowed to come back to this country. People, of course, that have come here as children are a different kettle of fish.
What if you fought in the army?
Well, and I think what you've got to look at is what the crime is that someone's committed, and what therefore whether they should be allowed to remain in British society or not. And clearly that's something to be reviewed as opposed to anything else.
Oz?
I have to say, I think the whole debate and behaviour of our government has been inhumane. I mean, it's very little I can say other than that. I think that we need to deal with the problems that we have ourselves, and I don't think that shipping people off to other places solves any of that, especially not if they were raised in this country from childhood.
But we would if it was to Albania or Venezuela, so why not to Jamaica?
Because, again, I have a problem with deporting our problems, and it's what is the point in prison? Is it punitive or is it rehabilitative? And this country still hasn't even started that debate properly.
Caroline?
I think if foreign nationals are here and they've committed a serious crime, then they should face deportation wherever they have come from. I think that's an important thing to do. I think most countries in the world adopt that procedure. You mentioned the point about the army. Our army does recruit from elsewhere, I think from Fiji and other countries around the world. So, that in itself cannot be an excuse if someone's committed a serious offence.
I think I ought to put a minute limit on all questions on this programme because they were so articulate in answering them. Final text question. This is from Melissa in Derby. Rory Stewart wants to sleep on Londoners' floors. Which politician would you like sleeping on your floor? Caroline?
Actually, I'd quite like to have Keir Starmer come and sleep on my floor so I can explain to him why the Brexit policy that Labour adopted all night long, I can explain to him why it was wrong.
You must have done that before.
Not all night and not on my floor.
Oz.
2 words.
I tried my best.
Richard Bergen. Because why not? Who wouldn't want to spend an evening, looking at those puppy dog eyes, huh?
Oh, well, it's a matter of taste, I suppose. Ella Whelan?
Mine's a weird one. I'm going to say Mel Stride because we've already had a sleepover, but not like that. We had a question time in Chester and we kicked our shoes off in the car and he wanted to convince me to join the Conservative Party. It wasn't going to happen, so eventually I just shut my eyes and he realised that I was falling asleep, but I was just waiting for him to stop talking, so I wouldn't mind rerunning that.
There you
Very
go.
nice man, but a chatterbox.
Bob Blackman.
Ian Blackford, because I'd like to explain to him the benefits of Scotland remaining a part of the United Kingdom.
Good luck with
Yeah, well, you would fall asleep, wouldn't you? Bless him. Well, thank you very much, all of you. Caroline Flint, Oz Katerji, Ella Whelan and Bob Blackman. Final text from Carlos in Devon. He says, great show. I can smell hope, change and vision gingerly returning to British politics. So your mission is complete on this programme. It's